you have any comment, just make it up written. We will take it up in the discussion. We're going to be recording the session as well. So if you would not like to be recorded, I would recommend you to turn off your camera. If you don't mind, you can leave the camera on. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a session now, followed by presentations, followed up by a Q&A participation as well. And everybody's more than welcome to join. So because we are running with time, what I'll do is I'll formally start this session. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ignacio Herrera Anchustegui. I'm an associate professor at the law faculty at the University of Bergen. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you in person. Good number of as well people are attending us online digitally. And we have the pleasure today to have a very interesting seminar where we'll be talking about business of clean hydrogen energy. And we know that we are in a crisis that is climate crisis, but also an energy crisis. The electricity prices have never been as high as they currently are now. Oil prices are very high. Gas prices are staggering. And this, fortunately and unfortunately, is not going to change very rapidly. Energy prices are going to be very high. That is also pushing us as society to find change. Transition. Energy transition is going to be now pushed even further than before for two reasons. The one is that the many of you here, young people that think climate change is a problem, that is one important drive. You are politically very influential. And also the other reason is simply it is too expensive. So we need to start moving on towards new technologies. And I think this is a moment in which is make it or break it for new technologies like the one we're going to be talking today, hydrogen and ammonia. And we're focusing on Norway and Canada. And today we're going to be having different speakers. I'm just going to be moderating the panel. We first will have Professor Lee Hancher. She's going to be taking the floor from the University, European University Institute in Florence, Florence School of Regulation, Tilburg University, and University of Bergen. And she's going to be talking about how green is your hydrogen and a definition. Then we will have Dr. Kristin Gulfransen-Freusa. She's an energy director of the University of Bergen, and it's going to bring us to the more academic discussion of hydrogen ammonia in Norway, some examples and what's going on when it comes to research in our country. Then we're going to move to Emil. No, yes, that is correct. Emil Haben, that is coming from Yara International, which is one of the largest hydrogen and ammonia producers in the world. And he's going to be talking about how can we accelerate and stimulate more investment in clean hydrogen. So how we get this one to actually become a reality and something happening here. Then we're going to move on to Associate Professor Rudiger Scherming from the University of Calgary. And he's going to talk about the next steps in clean energy discussion in Canada. And then last but not least, we're going to have Jonathan Cocker, partner in one of the biggest law firms in Canada, which is BLG. And sorry for my French, it's going to be very bad, but it's Borden, Ladner, and Gervais, I think it is. And you're going to be talking about a topic that is very interesting and close to my heart, social licensing, which is how can we make people to accept big hydrogen projects. So before we do that, I wanted to talk very briefly to some of you who we are, because some of you in the room are completely new to this. Some of you that are online are relatively new to us. Some are good friends as well. We are a research group for natural resources law, environmental law, and development law. That basically means we work with two things, climate change and energy. And we are a group of about 16 people that are currently working in different aspects connected to energy transition, climate change mitigation, and how we can do this from a legal perspective, something that we put a lot of emphasis in. And I am the manager or the one that organizes how to order food for very excellent people that we have here in the University of Bergen. The website, it's available for all of you in Norwegian and in English. If you're interested in the type of things that we do, please come in. And one of the reasons why we are doing this is because the University of Bergen is going to be a part of a very large multidisciplinary and integrated center that it deals with hydrogen, which is high value. High value is a center of excellence that has been granted towards study of renewable energy. And we are part of a center that will be running for the next 8 years. This received funding from the Norwegian Research Council, large funding. It's about 45 million euros in total of activities that will be running for hydrogen research. And the University of Bergen is an important partner in this, and the law faculty, we're very lucky to have been taken as an integral partner of it. And we're going to be working on hydrogen and ammonia in Norway for the world. That is the expectation. So very quickly about this high value center, we have more than 50 partners. This includes universities, research institutes, international places as well, but we have a lot of industrial associates that are going to be participating in this. And we cover really the whole value chain of hydrogen. So that means from how we produce it to how you utilize it, for example, in a bus or in a car or in some other technology that we'll be talking here today. And for us at the law faculty, which I think the majority of people in this seminar are lawyers, but not everybody, it is how we regulate it. And this is something very focal here in the project. And some of the things that we're working, we're going to be talking about different aspects of transportation and distribution of hydrogen. Very important how to regulate pipelines, access, and different things. We're going to be talking very closely connected to the topic of Jonathan's today, social indebtedness and impact, how we manage to get hydrogen projects accepted by people, because we know very little about hydrogen. I had no idea, not even where it was in the periodic table when I started working with it. The only thing I knew is that it exploded. That's it. Well, that's all I know. And if you ask my wife, she's much smarter than me, she will tell you it explodes and it's very dangerous. And it is the number one in the table, right? Yes. Okay. So Ignacio, you do your homework, she would say. And then the last bit is that work package. These are the names of the type of activities that we do. It's going to be led by the University of Bergen, the Faculty of Law, and the Business School of Norway, also located in Bergen. And we're going to be talking about integrating hydrogen in value chains. So how do we make technological progress happen in reality when it comes to businesses? Without further ado, let's go back to the agenda. And then what I would say is I'll give an invitation to Professor Lee Hencher to come here to the computer. And Lee's going to talk about the definition of what is green hydrogen. Very interesting topic. And what I'll do is I'll stop sharing the screen, change set of slides, and Lee, the floor is all yours in maybe 30 seconds. Thank you so much, Lee, for joining us. And the floor is all yours. Like all the speakers, we have about 12 to 15 minutes. And
thank you.
Should be working fine.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and for all the colleagues here from different parts of Canada and Norway, and everyone online for joining us. You've heard my name is Lee Hancher, and like Ignacio, I'm a lawyer, and I have absolutely no understanding of anything chemical. This is why my presentation is actually about a concept always close to a lawyer's heart, and that's definitions. What are we talking about? What are we talking about when we talk about clean hydrogen, or renewable hydrogen? And if we look at the targets that we set in the European Union, and these are of course also relevant for the EA, we are looking at producing 6 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2024 and 40 gigawatts by 2030, an enormous jump then. And in fact, not even content with that level of ambition, given the current crisis in the gas market, the EU, the Council of the EU, instructed the Commission of the EU to look again at these targets and come up with yet more ambitious targets, so that this figure of 6 gigawatts will be replaced by a target of 10 gigawatts by 2030. And in addition, we are looking at importing another 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen from third countries. And you see these aims set out in what's called the Hydrogen Accelerator Package, which was published in May of this year. Now, one of the big puzzles is what is clean hydrogen, or what is renewable hydrogen? And we're seeing a lot of proposals coming out of the EU, legislative proposals where we see these terms: low carbon hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, low carbon gas, renewable gas. And while those things sound inviting, we don't actually always know how to define these concepts. And that's because they're actually rather controversial as concepts. But they're key because, as I indicate here, once you define something as renewable, you then allow that fuel to qualify in European law under something that we call the Renewable Energy Directive Mark II, number 2, the RES Directive 2018. It will allow it then to benefit from a lot of state aid, a lot of public support. So getting the label renewable is very important for industry, and we'll hear more about investment in renewables today. But it's also important because there's a lot of concern that things are labeled renewable when they're not. And that concern, we call that greenwashing. And therefore, again, to have public trust in what's going on, it's also important to really just know what we're talking about. And you would maybe be surprised to find that you can look all over the place for a definition of some of these basic concepts. You can look in the ceiling, under the bed, or whatever, and you're not easily going to find it, except in what we call a delegated act. Now, those of you who know anything about European law might know that we have legislative acts, which are like regulations and directives, but we also have provisions in the treaty on the functioning of the EU, it's TFEU, for the adoption of delegated legislation. And what's important, of course, with delegated legislation is that it's the Commission that's really driving this type of legislation, and the other institutions, the Parliament and the Council, have very limited roles. And not surprisingly, just as in most constitutional systems, there are limits on what can be done through a delegated act. In particular, you're not meant to make political choices as the Commission in a delegated act. That's for the legislature to do. And what the Commission is supposed to do then is to kind of take that political choice and then give it, if you like, hands and feet that it can actually then be applied. Now, having said that, it might then seem strange that the only place at the moment where we have a definition of renewables in the hydrogen sphere is actually in a delegated act. And it's one called a delegated act on additionality. And it says, and I put the definition there, that renewable hydrogen means hydrogen derived only from renewable energy sources other than biomass. Now, I'm not going to go into the exclusion of biomass here today. This is a draft, and this is still out for consultation has finished, but it's still being debated within the institutions of the EU. In fact, if you're interested in the views on these provisions, you can go to the website of the European Commission. There are 344 submissions from interested parties, all looking at this definition of renewables, renewable hydrogen. So it's very controversial and very interesting. We have another delegated act. It's called the Methodology Delegated Act, and this will also be very important because it will define what counts to setting the greenhouse gas saving thresholds for these so-called renewable fuels from non-biological origin and renewable carbon fuels, the RCFs. And so what happens here is if the savings of a particular batch of hydrogen don't meet these thresholds, they will qualify perhaps as renewable hydrogen, but they will not then, those batches will not be able to count towards the EU targets for renewable energy, and hence they're less likely to get public support. So again, these definitions, they're in these kind of hidden away in these supposedly rather technical pieces of legislation, but they are really key. Now, what has happened is because there is so much debate about how we define renewables, because it's so key then to the whole process of rolling out clean hydrogen that we have in the Renewable Energy Directive itself, this RED II, various provisions that provide that it's for the Commission to develop a reliable methodology to ensure that electricity that's used to produce these fuels, these renewable hydrogen, is itself of renewable origin. And this means, of course, because electricity, you can't just look at an electron and decide whether it's renewable or not. You have to know a lot about how it's been produced, where it's been produced, and when it's been produced. So we get rather complicated rules in this methodology as to how we figure out the correlations, the temporal and the geographical correlations between where the electricity production unit in question and then the fuel production, hydrogen production. And what's really important is that these rules are designed to ensure that the fuel product is actually adding to renewable deployment or to the financing of renewable energy. And that's why we call it additionality. So what we want to know is what is extra, what's being done that will in fact increase the amount of renewable energy that's being utilized, and that the production of hydrogen will not just, if you like, suck in the existing renewable energy that's already out there on the grid. So the core purpose of these two DAs, the methodology one and the additionality one, is to ensure that when we start producing hydrogen on a bigger scale, we still make sure that this leads to net decarbonization. So we don't get involved in producing gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen and all the colors of the rainbow hydrogen except green. So we want to know that it's genuinely green. Now, what makes these rules rather obscure is that when you first read them, you think this is all about the production of renewable hydrogen in the transport sector. We have goals in this RED II directive about targets and the targets we need for the introduction of renewable energy in the transportation sector. But because this is the only definition we have of renewables, and because it's framed in a rather generic way, then in fact, definitions in this so-called Additionality Delegated Act will affect the entire hydrogen market in the future in Europe. So there is another renewable energy directive, which is helpfully called RED III in the making. And once we get the rules ready and oven ready, as the former Prime Minister in Britain used to say about Brexit, once we get these rules oven ready, they will roll into the new RED III. So it's really, really important. This little delegated act, it's not so little, but in legal terms, it's kind of, supposed to be a non-legislative instrument, but it will determine what can qualify as clean hydrogen, as renewable hydrogen produced or fuel produced from electricity, not just within the EU, but anywhere else, including then, of course, Norway. Now, the current rule, if we just look at around today, is rather simple. The default rule is that you just determine whether a production facility produces hydrogen using electricity, and you look then at whether or not the share of the fuels produced, these non-biological fuels produced, is equal to the average share of renewable electricity already on the electricity network of the country in which the hydrogen or the fuel production facility is located. Now, of course, for Norway, that's a very good rule because as with having hydrogen, not hydrogen, but hydro fuels, you are, of course, fully renewable. So the current situation works very well if you are a country like Norway. It works well for countries like Austria and Sweden, which also have rather large shares of renewable electricity already on the grid. It works less well, of course, for countries that don't, like Germany, France, and in fact, most of the other members of the EU. Now, I don't want to go into any detail about how we're going to work out when a hydrogen fuel is fully renewable, but there are various scenarios given in this delegated act. There's one called the direct line setup. So you can look to whether or not the hydrogen production facilities actually connect to the grid or not. If it is not connected, then we have what we call a grandfathering rule. And so the installation, the production facility, must have been commissioned at most 36 months before the hydrogen production facility was installed. And this is one of the big bones of contention. This is area of controversy, because as I said at the beginning, a delegated act is just supposed to implement policy. It's not meant to make policy. But although the red directive says that there should be a link between the facility and the hydrogen fuel after or at the same time as the hydrogen fuel facility comes into operation, in fact, this grandfathering clause allows the facility to have been in operation before, and even 36 months, so 3 years before. Now, the alternative way to check that something is fully renewable is something called the grid connection setup. And here, the idea is to show that the electricity used from the grid is demonstrably renewable. And there are 3 alternative scenarios to do that. I've listed them here. The only one I just want to point out that's really important, in fact, in practice, will be where a so-called PPA, a power purchase agreement, will be concluded, so that you can see from that agreement that the amount of electricity that will be provided is at least equivalent to the amount of electricity claimed as fully renewable. So the contract, if you like, provides the evidence that the electricity you're going to use to produce hydrogen is in fact fully renewable. So this is an important piece of evidence that you're allowed to produce. So when you combine these different tests, what is likely to happen is that you are going to have, according to a lot of very critical NGOs in the climate and energy space, that you'll encourage companies to load up on the production facilities, so electrolyzers, to make use of this grandfathering clause, so that in fact you can say, well, first of all, my capacity did enter into operation 36 months before these new rules come into force, 36 months before the electrolyzer is installed. And then on top of that, I have a PPA, which I can then use as evidence that the electricity I'm using is existing renewable energy. So there's no additionality. That's the big problem here, that this grandfathering clause then seems to water down the very purpose, if not take away the whole purpose of the legislative provision. Now, the industry, of course, says, well, if we don't have some flexibility and we need then a transitional period, we will never meet these targets. So we have to be able to produce renewable hydrogen from electricity with any existing renewable energy plant, as well as curtailed electricity, to reduce our costs. So these are 2 very opposing views. And it's important to realize just how controversial this is, because this is a delegated act. And the question is the Commission making a policy choice here? And if it is it allowed to do that under European constitutional law or public law? Because this choice has very important consequences. It's not going to be vetoed by the Parliament, the European Parliament. It can only be vetoed, in fact, probably in practice by the Council. So this is why we have very opposing views as to the merits of this additionality requirement, including this grandfathering clause. So on the one hand, people arguing, well, if it's going to be really stringent, really strict, then the whole feasibility of the sector is put at risk, and you will in fact have what we call a form of leakage, that the companies that actually are making the electrolyzers will move abroad. They'll move out of the EU and the EEA. And that means then that, in fact, the whole objective of the Green Deal is undermined. Now, the NGOs then, they're concerned that the Commission has exceeded its delegated powers, and it will encourage a massive increase in electricity demand and displacement of renewables by creating them accounting methodologies which will benefit some member states and not others. And these provisions that they plan to introduce actually are in conflict with very basic principles in the treaty and the so-called energy efficiency first principle, which stems now from the European climate law, which was adopted in 2021. So we have this extremely, I think, yeah, a very fierce debate going on at the moment. The draft legislation has just been tabled in July. So we have to wait to see what will happen, but it's very difficult for the Parliament really to stop it, as we've seen with the taxonomy debate. So what we will probably see is, if this legislation is adopted, we'll see a lot of legal challenge to it, because the argument is then this is not the right legal instrument to introduce this grandfathering and this type of distinction between different types of facilities in different countries. So what's in a definition? A lot of controversy, and a controversy that's not going to go away very quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Lee. So we will move on now to our second speaker. And our second speaker is going to take us from law and definitions, which, if I were your student, Lee, I will fail dramatically in the exam. I will have no answer or not even idea how to start. I will stop sharing here the screen. And then I'll introduce the second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Kristin Gulbrandsen-Foyse. She's the Energy Director of the University of Bergen. And she's going to talk to us about what is going on in Norway when it comes to hydrogen and ammonia. And just give me a second here so I can share the screen. And she's going to talk to us about what is going on with some examples in Norway on when it comes to hydrogen and ammonia. So we're moving from what color is your hydrogen to what is hydrogen and how do we utilize it. So thank you so very much, Kristin. It's a great pleasure to have you with us here. And again, the floor is yours for about 15 minutes. I will tell you if you're above time or so forth. We received one question in the chat. We will take it later on, but thank you for sending it in. So Kristin, the floor is all yours, and thank you so very much.
Thank you. And now we switch to a mathematician. So my background is not legal, but I'm applied mathematician by education, but I'm working as energy director at University of Bergen and has tried to learn something about legal aspects as well. So I've tried to give some examples, and it's just, I should stress, it's just some examples of how we use hydrogen and ammonia in Norway and what we do in order to promote clean hydrogen and ammonia production. So it's just a few examples. I think one of the first thing is this maritime sector, which is very strong in Norway and which has been a front runner when it comes to energy transition and zero emission ships. So the first is this, one of the starting points is Ampere, which is a ferry that crosses the Sognefjord, north of Bergen. it's a 6-kilometer long crossing. Takes approximately 20 minutes. And I've been told that when the shipyard that built this ship, Fjellstrand, here in this county, when they made a list of 50 ferry crossings in Norway that they could think about that should be electric, Sognefjorden, this Oppedal-Lavik was number 59. But it was picked by the authorities and the ferry is built and has been a great success. And that paved the way for today 80 electric ferries in Norwegian waters, which is a revolution. The next step is Hydra, which is the first ferry to be using liquid hydrogen. H2 is liquid. And it will be operating south of Bergen, or between Bergen and Stavanger in Rogaland. Some of you are very local, but this is a rather short ferry crossing. It's 3 kilometers, 13 minutes. And this ferry is being built, it is in operation, but right now it's in a shipyard to start installation of the hydrogen, and it will, just look at my manuscript here. So it will be in operation and running on liquefied hydrogen as fuel this autumn. And this is a commercial ferry, so it's the first one. When I asked this company running it, Norled, which has the ferry, when I asked them about is this paving the way for new hydrogen ferries? No, there are lots of plans for ships running on hydrogen, either compressed or liquefied, but there are, to their knowledge, none that is being built right now. So this is more one kind of, and the reason they told me is that maybe the main reason is a lack of hydrogen. So we have currently maybe a chicken and hen challenge. But this ferry, you can spring, for instance, you can travel with it. And I think it will be very interesting to see how people react to this, using it in everyday operation. Another example from maritime sector in Norway is this EU project. And this is a supply boat working in the North Sea for oil and gas companies. And this is an example of how a kind of organization and network and people knowing each other can really drive energy transition and technology development. Because this is the ship owner is located at Bømlo, which is an island in south of Vestland County. And this e-project was kind of organized by Maritime Cleantech. You can see that it's an organization promoting transition to zero emission shipping. And you see a lot of national and international partners in this EU project. Yeah, just a summary of this. And here is the timeline for this project. And the engine is being tested at Stord, which is an island close to Bømlo, where they have a test center that's doing a lot of very interesting tests, including this testing of this ammonia, the engine that is going to use ammonia. And we are very proud that it's the Finnish company Wärtsilä is having the engine, but the test is done here in Norway at Stord. And also, I think this kind of cooperation between many actors, both at Stord and in the larger region, has been instrumental to make this a success. And I think it will be a success, but of course we have to see when it's going to be demonstrated in 24 and 25. And it's going to be demonstrated in the very rough conditions in the North Sea. So it will go from various places in west and north of Bergen into oil and gas fields in the North Sea. So it's really tough conditions. So I think it will be a success, but of course conditions are rough and a lot of things can go wrong as well. But I think we should be very happy to have such kind of pilots and people that are front runners, because I think they make us see that you can do it, and that's important. Providing clean hydrogen. This is also from the same island of Stord. This company will utilize energy, for instance, hydropower, that could not be used because it's not connected to the grid. So this will actually add on capacity. And the idea is to produce it locally and use it locally. And just very briefly, starting up at Stord, and again, very close to this test center. So again, it's a kind of industrial hub, kind of industrial society, so to say. Starting with rather few kilos, less than 400 kilos. So it's a small factory, and then scaling up and starting with producing small amounts of green ammonia and also liquefying hydrogen. This is one site. This is another site, south of Stavanger, a bit larger dimensions, both compressed and liquefied hydrogen is going to be done there. I must also include research. And today, ammonia is mostly green ammonia, where and it's two steps. I think that's important to state, that you first produce hydrogen from steam reforming of gas, natural gas, and then you have this Haber-Bosch method to make ammonia. And I was very surprised when my colleagues at the chemistry department told me that 1% of the energy consumption comes from this production of ammonia and 3% of the CO2 emissions. That was new to me. And this Haber-Bosch is a very well proven technology. I'm sure you will talk about it maybe, but it's as you can see, very high temperatures and very high pressure, and it requires a lot of energy. So what we do is to do research on green hydrogen. The first is still to have these two steps where you produce hydrogen, but you produce it by electrolysis and it's then green. But you still have this Haber-Bosch method as the second step. But you're better. But you still have a rather low energy efficiency, and energy is a scarce resource, and we must also take into account that we should be as efficient as possible. So what we do, and this is included in this high value project that Ignacio presented, that it's also funded in separate projects from Research Council to UIB. This is to do it in one step, where you use water and air and do electrocatalysis and produce ammonia directly, and that is more energy efficient. It's currently research, but you can see it's better and it's promising, and that is one of our main research topics when it comes to ammonia at University of Bergen. Just to remind you about this high value, you have the website up there and the topics that are being dealt with in this project. So I think that's all for now.
Thank you so very much, Kristen. This was super interesting, and also it brings to us the perspective of what do you do with hydrogen? Because for me, when we speak about hydrogen, I have no idea what is going on. So now we know it's used for ships and for transport. I didn't even know that. Well, I knew that because that's what they tell me. No, this is very important for transportation. But very interesting to see all the potential that it has, but at the same time, the challenge that we see with the production of ammonia. 1% of world's energy demand for producing ammonia and 3% of CO2 emissions. That's crazy high. Just think about the potential for doing that and how you could lower this and reutilize this material. So it is about creating more and more technology here. So I'm going to stop here the presentation and I'll move on to the next slides. And then we're staying within Norway, but we're moving towards the business side. And then it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Emil Herven. And Emil, you're going to see the height difference in a second now, which is fine. I'm used to it. I live in this country. So yes, I think you see now the slides. And Emil, you're coming from Yara International, which is, as we mentioned before, one of the largest producers of ammonia and hydrogen. And your main focus of work, I understand, is how we make this production more renewable and more sustainable. That's what I understand.
Yes, exactly.
And it is a great pleasure to have you with us. Emil is not a lawyer, so he's a much more interesting person to chat with when you go for dinner. He has an engineering background and he comes from the Netherlands, but you have been living a few years in Norway. If I was understand, your second time in Bergen, the first time he has seen the sun. And he was for 5 days here in the summer, a couple of weeks ago. So Emil, it's a great pleasure to have you here and have Yara contributing with this seminar. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say about how we do the investment part. So we have spoke about what's going on in definitions. We have moved into applications. So how we go from University of Bergen ammonia research to where is the 55 billion euros that we need to put in to put this into perspective. I don't know how much we need to put, but quite a lot, I'm sure. Yeah. So I mean, the floor is all yours. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thanks for having me here. And yeah, I'll talk a bit today indeed about what does it mean to make investments into clean hydrogen. I put a question mark there on purpose because I really want to use this very knowledgeable audience to help me in a way solve this question, because I don't have the perfect answer. So I work for Yara. We are indeed one of the largest hydrogen producers and also consumers in the world, and at the same time also one of the largest ammonia producers and traders and consumers. So our idea is to there we go, to of course transition from what we currently do is make conventional ammonia, as was just shown, which is a very large scale process. In the world alone, there's about 180 million tons of ammonia being produced today, and the expectation is that market is going to grow, more than 3 times by 2050, because the idea is that hydrogen and ammonia, a major derivative of hydrogen, is going to be used to displace fossil fuels in the future. And so for us, that's also, of course, a very interesting business opportunity, not only to decarbonize our existing industry, as we make today, fertilizers and industrial chemicals, but also to use in new applications, such as shipping fuel and in the decarbonization of especially coal power plants. Now, when I say that we should, or ask, how can we accelerate the investment, I obviously assume that today things are going too slow. This is a chart I borrowed from a report by IRENA, it's an organization for renewable energy. And they have a very interesting graph, kind of showing the expected, or in a way, the necessary growth path for low carbon hydrogen and low carbon ammonia compared to how other fuels have been introduced in the past and how they've developed over time. And so you can see that the path for hydrogen needs to follow this immensely fast deployment if we are to achieve this 1.5 degree, or keep below 1.5 degree warming. So that's, to give you a sense of the scale, and as the previous speaker was also saying, it's very important that we move from kind of current tests, even though they are extremely important, tests that, like 1 megawatt electrolyzer scale and one ship being run on ammonia, that we really move to large scale application and testing very rapidly. Otherwise, we're never going to succeed in becoming net zero by 2050. Here's a chart I borrowed from Bloomberg the other day. So also to give you a sense of how much investment would be needed compared to today. Of course, it depends a bit on what kind of assumptions you make for different scenarios to get to net zero in 2050. But roughly speaking, we would need to double the investment in clean energy in total by 2025, and then afterward, triple to 2025, and then after that, we would need to double that amount again. Right. So, and already the amount that the world is investing this year has already been much more than what was invested in 2020 and 2019, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if we want to achieve this net zero by 2050, there needs to be a lot more investment into clean energy. Now, why is that investment not happening or not happening fast enough? That's a very complex question, because there are many elements that need to come together for an investment to be bankable, as we said, to make sure that all the risks are covered to a sufficient level. As an investor, you want to make sure that you get a return on your investment, and that as I said, all the risks are to a degree covered. And those risks today, you can categorize them in different blocks, but there are really, challenges, I would say, in lots of different areas when it comes to investment. And today I'd like to focus on one area in particular, but we can discuss all the other areas as well. But I want to talk specifically about the area of kind of the definition, kind of continuing on what Professor Hanscher said, the regulation around what really is hydrogen and what do we mean by clean hydrogen and clean ammonia. Here's just a snapshot of today's carbon pricing regulations, if you want, in different countries. This doesn't actually show the full extent of the complexity of this, I don't know how to call it, market or system of regulations. There's also a so-called voluntary carbon market, which is not at all shown here. My point is here that the way I see hydrogen certification schemes developing now and ammonia certification schemes developing, we're kind of going the same route here. Maybe not intentionally, but this is what this is probably what is going to happen, that we'll see lots of different standards and definitions around the world, each with their own rules and applications. And you can imagine that makes trade between countries and trade between different markets kind of difficult. And if trade becomes difficult, that means that investment also becomes more challenging. So what can we do to resolve that? Well, maybe first, just to show you, you can't see the top row, but it compares in a way some of the different hydrogen certification schemes that are currently under development. And I'm involved in a number of those, and I know Jonathan, for instance, is also a part of the Ammonia Energy Association. We're in the same group here. None of these schemes is exactly the same. They're applying somewhat different greenhouse gas methodologies, maybe setting different boundaries from where you start, so-called scope 1 or scope 2, scope 3, what you include, what you exclude. They're setting different thresholds for what counts as qualifying for this particular scheme or not. Different schemes may have inclusions of certain pathways, but not other pathways. There really are, if you dive into the details, there really are quite a lot of differences between them. And the challenge is, as I said, how can we have something that can scale to a global scale? Because ammonia is a commodity that is traded globally, and in the future will be traded even much more. Same with hydrogen. The application will be so much more than today. I would argue that we need to have something that is going to be globally applicable, and that is also to connect to the point made before. That is, in a way, setting the threshold at such a level that it actually allows this speed of investment to happen. Not to set the boundaries at first, or the thresholds at first so high that it hampers this large-scale investment. So how might this kind of develop then? Here's again a suggestion from Irina, and I think that might be what is going to happen, but I'm not sure that what you see is possibly that certification schemes at first tackle only the emissions from purely the emissions from production, and that they later on start to add emissions from transport and then from the conversion to, say, ammonia or other derivatives of hydrogen, that they then also start to include reconversion again back to hydrogen, for instance. It's also debated a lot, and that they may finally start to also include emissions that were part of the construction of, say, solar panels or the construction of electrolyzers. But all these things are at the moment really quite difficult, simply because lack of data or different standards being applied by different people who use this. Same as with the dimensions. In a certification scheme or in a definition of clean hydrogen, do you just want to look at greenhouse gas emissions, or do you also want to apply lots of other criteria? And I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. Do you want to set certain social criteria or certain governance criteria for what then should qualify as clean hydrogen or clean ammonia? And then lastly, I think we'll need to see some kind of introduction of this concept of additionality, which is indeed so hotly debated and such a controversial topic, and how we would deal with virtual trades of certificate. Rather, can we have certificates kind of traded separately from the actual physical product? Like you would have guarantees of origin now for renewable electricity, for instance, in Europe. Yeah, and then this international cooperation in a way extends through all the stages, because I think that will ultimately be the solution here, that we continue and step up the international cooperation and see where we can harmonize our different schemes and come to some kind of agreement or some kind of exchange mechanism, so that we can, as I said, allow for this trade to happen and allow for investments to scale. I think I'll leave it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mil. Let me adjust the camera back again because I'm omitted here. So I have to go down quite a lot. There we go. And I'm fine again. It's working. So now we're gonna move and we're gonna change continents. And we're gonna move now to Canada. And it's gonna be Associate Professor Rudy Scherning from the University of Calgary. And Rudy's gonna talk about what's going on in the law in Canada. And I need to find Rudy's presentation, which is here. Rudy, yes, so Rudy's coming now. And Rudy is also being a visiting scholar here with us at the University of Bergen. And he works with renewable energy, but also oil and gas, and particularly a lot of works on infrastructure, large infrastructure projects. So Rudy, the floor is all yours, but I'll start sharing the screen before I share anything. Make sure that this is working. Second. Too many slides open at the same time. Yes. Yes. All right, Rudy, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much. And go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. I've learned not to touch the microphone, but I always do it. So, well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Ignacio and the University of Bergen, included, for hosting me. And indeed, I've had a wonderful time already with you here in Bergen. Today, my plan is to give you somewhat of a short introduction to what is going on in Canada and what perhaps is not going on in Canada with regard to the question of clean energy and the clean energy discussion. And I'll do so, and we'll sort of contextualize our discussion by making a couple of observations, and those are three in particular. One, immense opportunity that is a direct linkage to the previous speakers. So that's really the sort of the forward-looking, where all of you in the room, in particular here in Bergen, come in. Then there's really one of, I would say, backwards-looking or of reflection, and that is some of the risks that we're going to face in the development of hydrogen in particular, but really related to the wider clean energy discussion. And I'll illustrate that by looking at the liquefied natural gas, the LNG industry, in particular in the Canadian context. And then there's one sort of what I would call the kind of global or the sideways looking, and that is really what we can do with hydrogen, beyond merely looking at it as an energy source, potentially or not potentially, but ideally for export. And this is really where the sort of the Norway energy security, potential export discussion, and certainly the Canadian discussion as well comes in. I've had the privilege of being able to teach and study in a number of countries, and what really distinguishes them is, do you have energy that you can spare and you can export, or do you not have it and you need to get it from somebody? And so that really is sort of a fast-paced introduction to the hydrogen question as well. What are we going to do with it? So where are we at with hydrogen in the Canadian context? Ignacio,
You're not moving the screen.
I'm not moving the screen? Are you doing it for me? Or am I doing it here?
Yes, this is not so techy.
Yeah, but I tried to. Oh, okay. All right. So, very good. So what's going on in the clean energy discussion, in particular in Canada? Not anymore after this. All right. So what are we talking about? We're talking about basically introducing hydrogen into the hydrogen conversation into a time of great, I've been told not to move away from the microphone as well, of great uncertainty, because we're really, as we've already seen in the presentations, Professor Hancher and Neil in particular as well, working towards this low carbon economy. Okay, we need to do something about it. I mean, climate climate concerns, carbon taxation, all of those kind of considerations are absolutely critical. And so we're introducing hydrogen and the hope that we have for hydrogen in that context. Okay. One of the things we've already seen, and Lee in particular really illustrated it very well for us, the lawyers in the room, this whole concern about, are you displacing the traditional fossil fuel corridor or sort of pathway with a view to looking at the renewables. And this is sort of where the rainbow of the hydrogen conversation comes in. The blue hydrogen in particular is from natural gas, something we have plenty of in the province where I'm based at in Canada. Or do you look at the renewables? That's sort of the renewable pathway, which of course Norway is a fantastic example, in addition to the offshore gas in terms of the hydropower. And that's kind of the green hydrogen. So I'm just quickly repeating what Lee already introduced us to. And then the role of carbon capture and storage. And that is going to be absolutely critical because there are places in the world that are not as favorable or positive, if that's the right word, on this whole idea of taking the carbon and sequestering and storing it underground. And that will, I think, also have a direct effect and a direct impact on what color of hydrogen you may be able to select. That presupposes, of course, that you are actually in a position of relative energy security, where you have that luxury of being able to say that, luxury of being able to say, actually, I would really like it to be only from renewables. I don't want it to be from this particular source. And then just the last really point on the slide here, this whole clean energy discussion that hydrogen finds itself in. And that again is the whole conversation of moving the production of energy closer to the point of consumption. And that I think is a really interesting discussion, and Jonathan and I have done some work on this. The whole idea of developing so-called hydrogen hubs. So you're localizing it. You're really bringing the production closer to the consumption. So where are we at in Canada's LNG industry? I've included that in the slides and in my presentation today because I really think, as I said in the introduction, we can't move forward in terms of trying to deconstruct some of the challenges that we have for scaling up hydrogen and ammonia, as Emil also presented, without being able to see what may not have gone as quickly, if that's the right word, in terms of Canada's LNG industry. And the whole idea in Canada is that sort of with the abandoned natural gas and at the time relatively low natural gas prices, that it would be exported to the coast, it would be liquefied, and it would be exported to the Asian Pacific basin in particular, but also earlier in the early 2000s, really with a view to potentially to Europe. And we've really had a number of projects that had been designated and selected for purposes, about 30 LNG projects in Canada that have been granted long-term export licenses by the regulator, by the federal regulator, but we've whittled it down to a couple really that are currently at the stage of construction and relative imminent completion. That obviously has influences of markets that I, as a lawyer here, will not be able to deconstruct for you. But we really have, perhaps, in some people's opinions, not been able to deliver as much on the LNG industry and our contribution to the global energy industry as many had wanted to do. And in some of the work that I've had the chance to be involved in, we've come up with this idea of the Energy Project Approval Challenge, which I'm happy to share my materials with you because we definitely don't have time to go into all of those. But it really has been quite difficult in Canada to be developing any new energy infrastructure, whether it is the gasification infrastructure, whether it's the pipeline infrastructure, and or indeed any of the energy extraction projects as well. And that is because we're in a greater time of climate urgency, and a much stronger focus, rightly so, on the ESG agenda, including, of course, the critical issue in Canada with regard to Indigenous peoples and the energy conversation. So has Canada missed out on the LNG opportunity? Well, in many ways, if you talk to folks downtown in Calgary and in the industry, yes, that is very much the case. And we're finding ourselves, as Lee also suggested, at a time of quite turbulent energy conversations at the moment. And the German Chancellor is in Ottawa, in Canada right now. And really the consensus there is that, well, we're not going to be able to export LNG from Canada to Europe, something that is desperately needed ahead of the winter. So Canada is not really able to do its contribution there. Canada may, however, be able to, in the next couple of years, export into the Asian market, which then would allow LNG shipments from places like Qatar to be displaced and not go into Japan or Korea in particular, very lucrative LNG markets, but instead be able to go to Europe. So it's a time of very, very interesting global LNG markets and a lot of that's happening. So that leaves us to the beyond the reflective part, and really now looking forward to hopefully a more positive conversation. And that is the whole hydrogen ammonia chain discussion that I'm here with you today. And one of the first things that I think is very, very interesting for those of you who may not know as much about Canada is that we have a tremendous opportunity to be producing hydrogen from different so-called pathways. And typically we have a lot of natural gas, which is using the old rainbow color coding, the blue. But we also have tremendous amounts, much like Norway, tremendous amounts of hydroelectricity capacity, particularly in the east, and an ever-increasing amount of renewables, including solar and wind, in particular also in the province of Alberta. And then in province of New Brunswick and Ontario, Ontario first, because that's where Jonathan is based, there's also a lot of nuclear energy from which potentially we can produce hydrogen. And the whole idea is that these different pathways allow us to really tap into a vast amount of hydrogen potential, and to be able to deploy it not only for export purposes, but also for really aggressively decarbonizing the Canadian economy, which is something that really is now legislatively mandated, and also as part of the Paris Agreement commitment, of course, really in focus. I'm just conscious of the time here, Ignacio, sorry. So I won't be too long on this particular point. So really why do I have this particular slide up here? It's designed to show you what we can actually do with the hydrogen. And that is beyond simply exporting it to places like Europe, for example, but we can also really use it to decarbonize our respective economies. So you see, for example, the transportation sector in particular, but also power generation and critically power storage, possibly some discussions of power to hydrogen in terms of sort of mega quasi battery scenarios, but of course critically as well for industrial processes. And I think that is a very, very interesting thing to keep in mind for those of you who are interested in this area, really what sort of lies ahead as to what we could and hopefully will be doing with hydrogen. Full and frank disclosure, we're already producing vast amounts of hydrogen in Alberta every day, so-called gray hydrogen, which is used for the refining of the oil sands bitumen, basically to make it much more liquid for purposes of transportation. So the emphasis in the Canadian hydrogen strategy of 2020, late 2020, we're all very excited, those of us in the circle, we're all very excited about this hydrogen strategy. There's a large amount of focus on exports. and particularly key European markets, but again, sort of the same repetition of the Asian exports towards Japan, South Korea in particular, were identified in the hydrogen strategy. And the real conversation that's going on in Canada right now with the German Chancellor is as to what Canada can do going forward for purposes of really scaling up hydrogen production with a view to go to Europe. And of course, as Professor Hanscher suggested, there is a preference to put it diplomatically in Europe towards the so-called green hydrogen. So really, that makes it quite interesting for us in Alberta to see, and Jonathan, I think, and I will probably discuss this on the panel, we'll really kind of be seeing a division in terms of, where some of the hydrogen produced from different pathways may end up going. So where are we at? Well, just like I said with the project approval challenges, we have to be very careful in Canada that the entire permitting and completion of the energy transportation and export infrastructure doesn't get bogged down extensively in the regulatory. And I think that's where, if you wanted to sort of be a betting man, it will be quite interesting to see whether the production of hydrogen from the renewable energy pathways is actually going to be something that may be more favorable than perhaps the blue pathway, given that there is justifiably quite a lot of focus again on what I would call loosely the ESG and the ever critical question of the social license that Jonathan is imminently going to talk to you about. But also safety, as we heard at the very beginning, it is, as Ignacio said in his introductory remarks, it is quite a volatile, quite a dangerous thing. I'm not a scientist, evidently. So, we have to be a little bit careful about that. And as just tagging on to what you, Emil, said, the whole idea of this, not just the hydrogen market development, really this question of, what is it that I'm getting? What is it that I want? And how is it going to really work in terms of, different certification standards and life cycle assessments? I mean, it's a terrible analogy, but if you really think about sort of different, the different electric chargers that you have to bring when you travel internationally, and when you have different devices, that whole kind of spaghetti scenario is something that I think we really have to be very, very conscious of and get it right. And I really like your sort of staggered approach that you suggested, I think, from the arena slides, Emil, to sort of say, okay, look, we have to start somewhere, but certainly on the understanding that we're going to be able to sort of bring in ever critical concepts and considerations in the discussion. And that takes us right back again to this whole discussion of carbon storage and what do we do with the carbon. I'm very conscious of the time, and I will literally conclude on this. 15 minutes is a very short period of time, Ignacio, but it's probably well intended on your part. And that is, what can we actually do with the hydrogen? And that takes us right back to sort of the initial slide that I have. Let me conclude with this. All right. There's so much we can do with the hydrogen beyond just exporting it and using it as an energy carrier, for example. It really would also allow us, if we really do want to take this serious, to sort of modernize our energy and transportation infrastructure. Questions that have been discussed, including language from the hydrogen strategy, the federal hydrogen strategy, about integrated energy systems, hydrogen corridors, all of that sort of fascinating stuff, at least in my opinion, that really allows us to see what we can do with this hydrogen opportunity. Repurposing an existing infrastructure is something that's also very acute from a European perspective, and then something that I'm involved in, really this question of what can we do with the physical infrastructure and what can we do about it with a view to physical climate impacts and the risks thereof. And last but not least, this is just a plug for something that is quite relevant in Norway as well. One of our colleagues is here from the University of Bergen in the room, who works on this very actively. And that's this whole idea of, can we use hydrogen, for example, low carbon or renewable hydrogen, with a view to, for example, decarbonizing the mining sector, which is a very large sector of the global economy. And as we increasingly is the right word, focus on sort of procurement of critical raw materials, of which Canada has a large amount. What can we do there to basically decarbonize that entire value and supply chain? So those are my concluding thoughts. We'll leave the rest for the discussion. And I thank you for your time and attention. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And now we're approaching our last speaker. And our last speaker, we have the pleasure to introduce Jonathan Cocker, and he's coming from all the way from Toronto. He's actually coming to Norway to be here with us for this event. And Jonathan, you have been working on different aspects of energy, but also environmental standards, permitting, licenses, and a lot of activities. And he is the only one that is a real lawyer here today, which is a rare feature.
My clients don't believe that. But.
No, okay, but I can tell you that you're the real one, because you're going to be probably stick to time. No, the only one that has not stuck to time is the colleague that is coming from the university, which is normally fine in the university settings. But then without further ado, Jonathan, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here, coming all the way from Toronto. I'm going to share the screen here, the slides.
Yeah. And congratulations on the 8-year mandate.
Thank you so much.
It's fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So congratulations to Bergen, to University of Bergen.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So you're going to talk to us about a topic that is very interesting, which is, we heard already, we need to invest a lot. There's a lot of applications that we can do. One of them, Rudy just mentioned it, decarbonized transport industry. That is the 3rd largest CO2 emissions in Norway. And most of you, I think, are not Norwegians. That is about 22% of all the CO2 emissions in the country. So it could be very large. So this is probably very positive, right? Because we want to have less CO2 emissions. Well, you will be surprised. People oppose a lot to this type of projects. And it is a lot of problems that are generated because we don't have what we call a social license to operate. And this is what Jonathan is going to talk to us about. Jonathan, the floor is all yours. So go ahead.
Thanks very much. And thanks to the University of Bergen as well for having me and for having the Canadian contingent. And, one of the questions we had, I think, coming into this is, what is the relationship between Norway and Canada in respect of clean energy, specifically hydrogen? And I think perhaps in the panel portion, we'll think about whether we're talking about some parallel learnings, maybe some different approaches. Obviously, I think you'll see the contexts are quite similar. And I think the social pressures, the environmental pressures, the economic pressures are shared. And I want to pick up on something that Rudy had in one of his slides. He started with LNG, and you might think LNG, that's yesterday's news when it comes to energy. But, and I think, Rudy, I saw on your slide specifically reference to Petronas. And Petronas is a large international LNG producer, I think based in Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken. And Petronas in Canada had both the benefit and the detriment of getting a significant permit from the Canadian government. And you might recall this, Rudy, maybe circa 2015 or so, in respect of LNG production and export. 2015, they get this permit. It's wonderful. They're going to export LNG. There are 193 conditions in that permit, 193. Included in that permit were things like co-determination rights with local communities, environmental observers, environmental overseers, right? Reporting in every way possible, right? Standards that were never commercial previously, the kinds of things that ultimately were part, not all, but part of the reason that Petronas handed back the permit and said, thank you, but no thanks. We don't want this. We can't operate under this kind of permit. And to me, that was really the culmination of probably something we saw over about 20 years, maybe 30 years in the energy sector, where we went from effectively a carte blanche regime in respect of certain kinds of activities to something that was ultimately heavily regulated and for which the local communities and the sort of broader community were heavily invested in how these projects operate. And that's about 2015, maybe that's 2010, something in that space. Something had flipped, I think, in many countries where business as usual was no longer acceptable. But now it's 2022, and we've got this new game in town, and that's hydrogen. But all those expectations are already there. All those considerations, they're already there. They're not going anywhere. The communities aren't going anywhere. So now we've got a new energy, but those existing communities say, well, we don't necessarily have a different view because you're calling it hydrogen and it's going to be the answer to all our problems environmentally. We've got the same expectations. So the dynamic is one where you've got two forces kind of coming together. We've got this idea that we need to do this by 2030. We saw, Emil, we saw the slides, right? We saw how much importance is given to this, the growth in hydrogen needs to be exponential immediately. But on the other side, we've got all these communities, ones we all live in, where we say, well, wait a minute, what is this new thing? How are we going to participate in it? How is this going to be safe? Where's my opportunity in this? What's in it for me, right? So I think that's the tension, and I'm talking about Canada, but I'm really talking about every country in the world when we get there. And so when we think about strategies, global strategies around things like hydrogen, those strategies abut against local expectations of local conditions. And I had this very same discussion. I was in the north of Canada, in an Indigenous community in the north of Canada. It's a territory that was established by the Inuit people, and we had these same discussions, and and the view was, this might be good for us, but we really want to see this play out elsewhere first. Call us in 30 years, thanks. When you've got this all ironed out, don't come to us first. We're not going to be the guinea pigs. We were the guinea pigs in these other sectors, in the extractive sectors. We're not going to be the guinea pigs anymore. So I think, there's a sense of that as well within these communities as to what those expectations are and when they think the conditions are right.
Let's click on the screen.
I'm going to click like that.
Should be fine.
There we go. So when we talk about hydrogen, I think one of the things we don't have is we don't have any experience in terms of what the standard should be for the community. We don't have that sense like, okay, it's a hydrogen project. Here's the checklist. Like we've kind of evolved that way in things like mining. Maybe we've evolved that way in terms of oil and gas, but we don't have that checklist yet. And there are producers out there that say, look, all I'm doing is I'm drawing from the grid, I'm putting an electrolyzer in, and we're going to supply something local. So why are you comparing me to an infrastructure project that an offshore oil and gas project that has all kinds of environmental complications that my project doesn't have? So we don't currently have that playbook yet as to what a hydrogen project needs to look like. So what should the social licensing be in respect to those projects? We don't know yet. And of course, as I said, it'll be malleable community to community, but I'm also going to suggest it'll be malleable in terms of its purpose. That I'm going to suggest to you that depending upon what the project will do, that the social license may well be different. And I think you've heard, Rudy, you've shown it in your slide. When we look internationally at what's happening in the hydrogen markets, everyone wants to sell hydrogen. They want to make hydrogen, but what they really want to do is sell hydrogen. And where do they want to sell it? Europe, Western Europe, right? Maybe Asia as well, but Western Europe. So we all, there is a sort of a bit of a Wild West out there. We all want to, we want to establish this export industry. And I'm going to suggest to you that as an export industry, we might find the standards for social licensing might be a little different than if we're talking about domestic transportation use, for example, right? They might be different. So these are things I think that are out there that we should be thinking about and talking about. So another challenge we've got industrial hydrogen, obviously we've got industrial ammonia, other and hydrogen and markets. And I think in the communities, we don't have a clear differentiation between those industrial applications and these new energy applications, and how should they be treated differently and how should they not. And I'm going to suggest to you that the producers of hydrogen, producers of ammonia, need to fully grasp this, that they're in the energy space, and the energy space has different kinds of expectations around it. And maybe, just maybe, the industry hasn't fully internalized that in ways that they need to in terms of their processes. But that is coming, and hopefully no one has to learn that the hard way, but I think it's coming. No clear acceptance around the parameters of license terms. I'm going to say something to you that will sound crazy to industry, but I think potentially makes sense. If we have a regulatory floor for hydrogen projects, if we have that floor, that will ultimately assist proponents, project developers in terms of satisfying social licenses. Because without that floor, the expectations, the community expectations, can go right to ground zero. And those expectations, as we'll talk about, can be onerous, can be multifaceted, can be difficult to anticipate, and certainly difficult to satisfy. So I'm going to suggest to you that if we have a robust floor, like we do in other industries, then we can build from there on social license, and everyone knows what the bedrock is. Without that bedrock, then we're anywhere and everywhere. And then I want to talk about the governments, those stakeholders, those governments who have been pumping up hydrogen in respect of their domestic strategies all over the world. Politically high profile. I think last time I looked, there might have been 40, 45 national hydrogen strategies out there. It's probably higher now. But every one of them says essentially the same thing with some kind of nuances. And that is that hydrogen is going to help us economically. Hydrogen is going to be more socially inclusive. It is going to solve our environmental problems. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be an export. It's going to be new technology. It's going to be all these things for us. So, yesterday we kind of fell down in terms of our economic development, but now we've got this new thing. It's called hydrogen, and it's going to be great. And it's in all these policies. And so as a developer, if I were going into a country and saying, I'm going to develop hydrogen in this country, what I would do is I'd look at that policy, because I'm going to see that policy again. And I'm going to see it probably, dare I say, in a regulatory hearing, where someone pops up and says, oh, by the way, have you read the government strategy to approve hydrogen? And here's what it says. All these fabulous things that have to be done for hydrogen projects. And of course, the developer, has a much more narrow focus. They're trying to make a dollar. And we know hydrogen currently is not necessarily economically that viable. So suddenly the government's promising the world for these projects, and the developer says, well, hold on a minute. I don't have the pockets to really deliver on all these things. And you promised all of these things. So I think, what we're seeing out there is a great deal of hyperbole. And I think, again, that's going to be part of that tension, that social tension between trying to get these projects off the ground environmentally, and then socially satisfying all these expectations, which are really off the charts. Rudy had a slide in respect of what the hydrogen markets can be. I think this is the gold standard. Thank you, Siemens. But I think the point of it is you'll see all of the different applications, and I think when you look at these applications, you might say to yourself, should the social licensing be the same? Should the expectations be the same for all of these things? And I think the answer has to be no. In my mind, it would make no sense for all of these different applications to have the same exact footprint as to what one needs to do to get these projects licensed. That's my sense of it. You can take it up with me in the panel portion. So I talked about license variability. As we mentioned earlier, we've got things like domestic versus export. The nature of governmental support. A lot of these projects have the deep pockets of the government behind them. But with it's kind of a Faustian pact to some degree. You take government money, and suddenly there will be additional expectations on the social licensing side, and they won't give you the license. A lot of my clients say, look, I've got the government there, we're arm in arm with the government. We're going to get money, brackets, we're going to get this approved because the government's giving me money. Well, the government, ultimately, there's a branch in most countries that delves out the money, and there's a branch that approves things, and the two necessarily aren't the same. And of course, the second a third party shows up, a stakeholder shows up, then all bets are off. And that money is contingent, of course, on approval, and good luck to you. So you've asked for the money, but now you've dragged in those kind of governmental expectations, and your project is even more fraught with challenges because of the fact you're dipping into the public purse. And most projects I've seen out there delve into the public purse on hydrogen, most, right around the world. And I just want to touch briefly on Indigenous before I go. In Canada, we sometimes talk about IESG, Indigenous, right? Environmental, social, and governance. And I think, one of the things that I've been learning slowly but surely, I think, in terms of engaging with local communities, Indigenous or otherwise, when they look at something like hydrogen, they say back to the developer, how do we get a long-term, how do we get long-term viability for this? Where's the mobility ability for us? So you bring this project here, you brought mining projects here, but the best we can do is ultimately obtain employment, in respect to that project. But where's the jumping off point to go elsewhere, to take these projects elsewhere? And I think universities have a place to play, a role to play in that. So in other words, can you develop a technology hub that gives people and communities the ability to actually train people up and go out into the world and take what they've done in their local communities and find employment elsewhere? I think that's one of the things we don't think enough about, and that was loud and clear in my time in Nunavut a few months ago. No presentation on hydrogen is complete without talking about Denmark's Power to X. I mean, that goes without saying, obviously. There's 4 conditions in it, and if you look at them, so this is the mandate, the Danish mandate in terms of what their strategy should be. Obviously, they check the box on their environmental goals. They're certainly very much interested in focusing on their strength to make sure that this is long-term. Integration, obviously, with the existing energy system. That gets overlooked sometimes, but obviously, if you're talking about green hydrogen, electrolysis, that's a significant drain potentially on existing resources. And last but not least, they want to export products and technologies. All right, so when we talk about hydrogen end markets, we're also talking about technologies. So there's potentially the ability to develop technologies, including here in Bergen, right? So I think that's significant, right? It's for those of us who've been in this sort of resource export world, right? Canada being unfortunately close to the bottom. So in other words, you export the raw material, you don't produce the high value end product. Here is another market where I think this comes up over and over and over again, right? Are you going to be the one that sells that high value end product, or are you going to be the one that simply shifts off the raw resource? And I think we need to have that discussion in many countries as to where we position ourselves. Okay, well, thanks very much.
Thank you so very much, Jonathan. So we have kept quite well recently on time. So what we will do now is the most fun part of what this is about, which is to have a discussion. So I'll invite the 4 presenters that we have had today, Kristin, Emil, Rudy, and Jonathan. Please take a seat and we'll move forward. And what we will do is we're going to take questions from the audience. And I am aware that it's 16:36, so a lot of people are tired. If you want to grab a coffee real quickly and come back, sit again, that's fine while we take a seat. But we're going to do this for about 20 minutes, and then we wrap up the event. I think that'll be the best. And for those of you in the audience, please feel free to send us any questions that you might have. So what we're going to do is we're going to test one of these ones. So Hello? There we go. Yes, no, 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 no sound. Okay, strange. Try. Hello? No, nothing. Let me try this. No, this is muted as well. Now, yes, good. So now we have a sound here. And what I'll do is I'll pass around the very anti-COVID, but that's fine. The mic. And the first thing I'll do is I'll ask, yes. Yeah, I'll have to move the camera. Very good. Thank you so much, Anna. And then the camera is moving automatically there. Now we see all of us here. Just let me share the screen to a different slide as well. So what we're going to be doing now is discussing a little bit on different aspects. And the first question is, does anybody in the audience or in the chat has any questions that you want to ask to the panel? Not for the time being? That it's okay, but then I'll start with one question for all of you. And you have to be quick. You have 10 seconds. Let's start with the first one. That is the one that I think is the easy one. What's the biggest challenge for hydrogen? 10 seconds.
Energy efficiency.
I think we need to get over this prejudice of green versus blue.
Understanding what it actually is. So yeah, exactly.
I'll go for cost. Yes, so we have different aspects that are challenges, and all of them are complicated. And I see now one question that is being sent here in the chat. I'll read this one. I know, Kim, thank you for sending this one. I've not forgotten. The question is very long, so I'll try to read it while I ask another one and the answer, and then I come back to it. Everybody's looking at here the question on the chat, so we will go back to it. But I have a different question. Now let's go back to this 10-second answer. What is the potential for Canada and for Norway to do best in hydrogen? So can we start with Emil and then we move back here?
To do best. I think both can be powerhouse, a big exporter, clean energy.
Yeah, I think when you say best, probably, yeah, green hydrogen. Really using that power of the hydro, the renewables, the offshore, etc. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest the maritime sector is one where I think both countries can be world leaders. So that's again one of those parallels between the two countries.
Yeah, I was also to say American sector.
I know I stole that.
But I would also stress that we should do both the export of and utilize resources, renewable energy that cannot be connected to grid and stored in other ways, and to do technology export as well. So I think that we have that in common as well.
Great. So now we have a question from the audience, from the chat here. Kim, are you there? Are you listening to us? If you are there, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. I don't think so. We know the sound works. So if you're there, Kim, we can ask you, but if not, I'll read it. So Kim is asking, the US very recently enacted the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a game changer for clean hydrogen production, more so than for transport. It appears that the approach in the act is to focus on the life cycle emissions, not the other sources. Given the very ambitious targets in the EU, would it not have been better to focus on the emissions rather than talking about green hydrogen and limiting this to renewable based on hydrogen? This is so, especially so when it comes to imported hydrogen. It could be produced in the cheapest possible way, including the cost of CCS, and this could be actually getting closer to the target volumes. So anybody wants to try to answer this question from Kim?
Well,
yes, just 1 second.
Yeah, I mean, I think Emil made a comment earlier about transition. I think when we look at the expectations around hydrogen markets, we have to look at how we get there, understanding that it may not be where we end up in 2050, but certainly it'll be part of our journey. So I think we need to make sure we're looking at clean hydrogen
which in my mind can include a blue hydrogen, obviously with a CCS component. I mean, I think that's got to be part of the offer in my mind. And I think the focus in the EU, I think at times might not be reflective of the international community more broadly. I know the Hydrogen Council says we just care about low carbon hydrogen. That's what we care about. So our members come from both sides of the fence or from the full spectrum, perhaps, and that's all we care about. And we see that being the best way to commercialize hydrogen in the near term. And then we'll see down the road. We'll see. So I think that's, in my mind, that's where we're going. So I think whether the Biden administration has it right or not, I think that's the broader policy that we should all be pursuing.
Anybody else wants to add something on this? And Kim, I read that you're with your children at home. That's absolutely fine. If you want to say something, you can unmute yourself. We can't tolerate children screaming in the background. That happens a lot in the office, so it's fine. Usually it's students being tortured or children, but you don't have to say anything either. And the same goes for anybody in the audience here or in the audience digitally. If you have a question, just feel free to ask it. So really, that is not a problem whatsoever. But since I see that no one is asking any questions, that means that it's my turn to ask a different kind of question. So this is a law faculty and I have to ask a law question. But I would like to try to see what the non-lawyers also think about it. Do we need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to the regulation of hydrogen? And what I mean with this is we have been working with energy. And one of the aspects that we have been discussing is energy has been moving around and we have utilized and increased the energy consumption in the world since 1950s to an extent that we have never seen before. So we have consumed in 40 years or 50 years of mankind, we have consumed much more than we did for 40,000 years of CO2 emissions, right? And the question now is, we have a set of rules. We have a new player in the field. Do we need to change radically something from the regulatory perspective? Or can we live with what we have and adapt what we have to tackle with hydrogen? Anybody wants to say something about this?
People first, and then
Yeah, just give it to the prof. Yes.
Well, look, I think it goes back to what I said earlier in my speed dating question. Right? There's like the whole, what is it? Like, do we want it to squeeze it into the petroleum regime? Is it the electricity regime? Are we looking at, exporting energy? Are we looking at exporting something that contains the energy, which would be, let's say, the ammonia? I think it probably does require something new and a new approach, and partly also because what Jonathan said in terms of that sort of great variability. It's not just hydrogen; it's hydrogen from what, for what, by whom, and I just think we sort of allowed here in terms of one of the discussions we have in Canada in terms of the environmental impact assessment conversation is, are we going to be able, should we, will we, if so, how, going to take into account, for example, what somebody that purchases the hydrogen from Canada does with it, and whether we should be taking that into account, and where the whole accountability goes, and then what does that do to the idea of having quite a liquid global hydrogen market? Because all of a sudden you're sort of reintroducing, albeit in a different sort of perspective, from an environmental perspective, and maybe you're sort of reintroducing the whole destination kind of restrictions, and you're saying, okay, it's okay for this hydrogen project to be approved in location X in Canada on condition that it is shipped on such and such sort of technology across the Atlantic, and it's used by consumer Y in this particular jurisdiction. And I think that's quite dangerous in terms of that kind of makes it really, really complex, and will probably put a really put a spanner into the whole idea to get going on this. And just maybe go back to the initial conversation about sort of the early days of offshore oil and gas. I mean, it was it was very much a different time, that's for sure. But also, you had to get going. There was a real need, because of the energy security concerns there. And so you had to get going, and you had to learn, and you had to really sort of adjust. But I don't think we're going to find a perfect regulatory regime at this stage. And again, I'm going to go back to your slide. You know, this, can we add things on? We need to be able to add things on as we progress and as we have a better understanding as well of the beast that this hydrogen economy is actually going to be. That's my very long answer. Kristen.
Yeah, kind of from a more technical perspective, I think we need to make understand the security challenges and to address the most important of them. And again, it's very tempting to point to the work done at the Department of Physics and Technology at the University of Bergen, where we're looking at the safety issues and how you should put regulations, because currently we do not have enough experience. So you have to partly adapt, but also to do research testing in order to get the kind of right security level. And it has been pointed out by some of my colleagues that when you have an accident with hydrogen, you stop development. For instance, in Norway, we had this Ammonia accident, but you do not do the same with petroleum gasoline, because you're familiar with it. So you have a different perception of security and risk, and that's of course a topic. So we need to find the right technical security level in order to not hamper the development, but not take too many risks either. So we have to utilize the knowledge and build some new knowledge. But I would like to also, if I'm allowed to comment on another thing, and that is hydrogen should be used when it's needed. But if we can use power directly, we should do that due to kind of efficiency. And I think we should also make that clear, very clear, that hydrogen and ammonia is less energy efficient, but it might be very needed in some cases. But when we can use power directly, we should do that. I think that should be stated very, very clearly.
That's a very good point, Kristen. Because just to try to clarify this for the audience, particularly in the room, that I'm suspecting that you're wondering, what is she meaning with this? So what it's meaning is that if you utilize electricity directly, the efficiency is much better. So because to produce hydrogen and to reutilize it, you lose energy, okay? So that means that we should use hydrogen when we cannot use something else that is more efficient. And that is, for example, in your car. That's why electrical cars are so much better than gasoline cars, because when you use a gasoline car, 70% of the energy is just heat. So you are actually utilizing much less of what you put into the car to make it work. And this is an aspect here. But is there any questions before we have one last comment from all the speakers? Any questions in the room or online? Yes, we have actually two. Excellent. So I think I know who you are, but say something. Who are you very quickly? State your question. I'll repeat it here on the mic.
Sure. My name is Arik. I'm a PhD candidate and I research regulation of offshore wind comparatively. So Norway, Denmark, and England. So my question goes to Rudy and Jonathan. Jonathan, you mentioned a license in which some 193 conditions had been imposed upon the developer, social requirements, right? So that made me think, was that licensing process developer driven or was it state driven? Because it would never make sense to me that a developer would impose such onerous requirements on himself.
I think you've answered your own question.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and okay.
Yeah, Jonathan, just give me a second to say what the question was about in the mic for the audience, that it's online. So I think it's asking basically a license with 193 social conditions that Jonathan was informing us before in Canada. Was this a project that was driven by the state or by a developer itself? This is what normally happens in, for example, wind projects where you have two models. One where the government is the one guiding the process. For example, that's what Norway is supposed to intend to do. And another one where it's the companies that are deciding how we're going to drive this, and then the government kind of sits back. That is the question.
Yeah, and okay, obviously it was state-driven, and I'm going to suggest to you that hydrogen projects, big ones, are going to be state-driven for the foreseeable future. And I think that means a lot more conditions, a lot more process, and a lot more time and expense in getting these projects over the line. Because I think there's a sense that we all have ownership in this. You know, this decarbonization, we all have to sort of do our part. And as a result of doing our part, we also have ownership in terms of what's new, what the solution is. So I think that kind of communal thinking is creeping back into the energy sector.
Yeah. Can I ask your views on this, Emil? Because you work in the industry. So are you feeling more comfortable if the government tells you you need to do this rather than you telling the government, we think we should do this?
I think the answer might be obvious, but I think maybe coming back to your point, Jonathan, I think we're also seeing now already several companies around the world, potential customers of ours, asking, okay, when can we actually buy clean hydrogen, clean water? And so we clearly see a market already developing while the regulations are not ready yet. And so, and to come back to your point, there are countries around the world where they're very happy with stimulating this investment in clean hydrogen. And we're also a big part of that. The challenges that we have is that obviously these investments are quite long term. You don't build a hydrogen plant that lasts 5 years. These are multi-billion-dollar investments. So we want to kind of anticipate what also the regulations are going to be. But yeah, we're not always going to wait for the regulations for governments to say this is what's going to be. There are plenty of customers already willing to move ahead, and they feel the pressure of achieving these net zero goals. So I think that's in the way. We're positive, and I hope they can also set this time. I also want to kind of dispel maybe the myth that industry is this kind of evil empire that's going to ruin the world. We're just going to ignore communities and all that. Not at all. We have our own ethical guidelines. And we're really, I think, all working towards the same goal. It's just, I think that maybe we're a bit more practically oriented than theoretically.
Good. We have 4 minutes to go, so I'm going to do the following.
No, sorry.
Now, wait a second, Rudy. I'm going to do the following. So we have one question here from the gentleman, but we also, I think I saw Kim that he turned off your camera. If I'm not mistaken, it's Kim Talus, a professor of energy law from the University of Tulane. Kim, if you want to ask a question, you have the floor. Be quick, and then we move on to the other question, and then we get a panel answer.
I made an escape to the office. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good.
I'm not showing you on camera, but I can see, I saw you and I recognize the face. Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to continue to my question. The comment is not, or the question was not to suggest that green is not good or anything like that, but rather that very unfortunate crisis that we have in Europe have really shown and underlined that sustainable energy transition is completely conditional on energy security. And the crisis has also shown that if you decide to eliminate something from the supply chains or supply structure, you better be sure that you have the means to meet the ends, that you have something instead. So if you exclude fossil or nuclear-based hydrogen, you really have to be sure that you have enough renewable-based hydrogen. And if you look at the EU policy or targets at the moment, they are extremely ambitious. And my argument is that they're probably too ambitious in the sense that you can't meet the targets. It's not a question of just investments and money, which is a big deal, of course, but it's also the material for all the equipment and installation that you have to have, the manpower to actually do that, and many, many other things. So that was the point in the question, that rather than looking at green, we should at least start by looking at clean.
I think that's a very, very valid reflection, Kim. Thank you for joining us also in the seminar, much appreciated. And then what I'll do is gentleman here in the background. Can you ask your question?
Yes.
And can you tell us where you come from? What's your name?
Yeah. So my name is Piers. I'm an exchange student from Germany, and my question is whether shouldn't we focus on delivering the more green hydrogen energy to countries where, like now, our plans to build new coal plants, for example, or gas plants, which we don't know exactly how clean compared to our coal or gas plants they are, instead to deliver them to to Europe, where we have quite good regulated plants. So instead of building new coal plants, we shift the already produced greener energy there, instead of contributing more to Europe to to get a better way to matching the 1.5 or 2 degree goal on climate change.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to reinstate the question that Tobias from Germany is asking here. So an exchange student. Welcome to the University of Bergen. Very pertinent question. Which country should be the one receiving the hydrogen? Are the ones that where good energy policy exists, the ones that actually need a faster change? Who is going to benefit from this, and what are we going to be substituting? So I'll leave the floor, only maybe perhaps 2 comments, because we have 2 minutes to go. Who wants to say something short to answer to Tobias? And we can, of course, chat later on the coffee, and you're more than welcome to have some coffee, some cake, chat with the presenters, but let's try to stick to 1 minute to 1 minute and a half.
I think it would be hard to export hydrogen to countries that have no infrastructure. So I think that would be one challenge. So you need to export to countries that have infrastructure. And also going back to my point earlier, that it might be better to help install solar power and other direct other ways of producing electricity directly in developing countries. So I think it's better to have a very efficient program for installing solar panels, and also we should have a very close look at the saving energy. That should be the most important thing to do, at least in Europe. Save energy by all means.
Anybody else? Last famous words?
I'll make I think a great question. I think I'll make a related comment, and that is that these international hydrogen markets really put the regulators and the receiving communities into the supply communities with hard questions, right? So it starts to become a lot more transparent and a lot more probing as to what the domestic practices are, energy practices are, which then gives rise to those exports. So I think that's something else we want to keep an eye on.
Thank you so very much. With this is 17:00. I'm the only Latin American that is actually punctual. So we're going to finish here. And I'd like to ask an applause for the panel. That was great. And also, I would like to really thank you that came here in person. Thank you so much for joining us for this first